What would you do if the two people you trusted most, your wife and your own daughter, secretly joined forces to betray you? This is the story of how a loving husband and father uncovered years of deception, exposed a secret affair, and brought down everyone who stood against him. But the ultimate revenge wasn't just about winning in court. It was about making sure their lives would never be the same again. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy stories of betrayal and justice, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more shocking tales. Now, let's step into this intense journey, my wife and daughter's secret betrayal, and how I destroyed them both. I first saw Emily on a damp autumn evening in Portland, the kind where city lights smeared across rain-slick streets and every breath felt like it could carry the start of a story. I was 20, still naive enough to believe that fate could be captured in a single moment. She was 19, wearing a crimson scarf that stood out like a flare in the crowded house party. Her laugh came easily. She leaned in when she listened, and she had that unshakable calm that made you feel like you'd known her for years. We talked for hours, ignoring the blur of people around us. She said she wanted a life built on love, not convenience. I told her I wanted someone who would believe in me when the world didn't. It felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Within weeks, we were inseparable. Late-night drives along the Willamette River, greasy diner breakfasts at 2 in the morning, dreams shared over mugs of cheap coffee. By the time she turned 21, Emily was pregnant. I was working as a junior programmer at a small but fast-growing tech firm, pulling long hours but making enough to imagine a future. Marriage seemed inevitable, not from obligation, but because I wanted to make her my family in every sense. When Sophie was born, tiny and fierce-eyed, I felt a pride so raw it scared me. I thought I'd built the foundation for something unshakable. Then life tested that foundation sooner than I expected. Emily's father, Harold Evans, suffered a construction accident that left him paralyzed from the waist down. He had been the sole breadwinner for their household. Without him, Margaret, Emily's mother, was overwhelmed. They lived in a cramped apartment, bills piling up, the threat of eviction looming. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, watching Emily twist her wedding, her eyes wet but determined. "They can't do this alone," she said, and I agreed. Without thinking twice, I offered to have them move in with us. It felt like the right thing to do, the noble choice any good son-in-law would make. What I didn't realize was that opening my door to them meant opening my life to a constant undercurrent of interference, judgment, and quiet resentment. Margaret brought her rules, Harold his quiet dignity, and Emily's younger sister, Chloe, her restless energy. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd be one big, supportive family until they could stand on their own. Looking back, that moment, when I said yes without hesitation, was the first step toward everything that would one day burn to the ground. But at 23, holding my daughter in my arms and believing in the woman I'd married, I couldn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. Not yet. Morning changed first. I would come downstairs to find the coffee already brewed, weak and pale, the way Margaret liked it, its thin aroma drifting through the kitchen before my alarm finished its second ring. She treated my kitchen like a general taking a hill. Labels appeared on jars, a new ledger sat on the counter tracking every grocery expense, and a list on the fridge dictated which brand to buy and which store had the better price. At dinner, she served portions with the firmness of a nurse. And when I reached for seconds, she tapped the ladle against the rim of the pot and said we were watching expenses. The word "we" did not mean me. Harold kept to himself, sitting for hours by the window with his hands folded, wearing that quiet dignity that almost made me feel guilty. It wasn't him who crowded the air. It was Margaret's voice, a steady drip of words that could carve grooves in stone. She praised me to neighbors for taking them in, then asked in private whether my salary could stretch to a bigger place. She wondered aloud if my mother's will might one day be better used for a family home, by which she meant her family. Emily began to change too, though it happened slowly. She and Chloe cooked dinner together, cleaned together, and after Sophie went to bed, I would hear low voices rising from the kitchen. If I walked in, the conversation stopped. If I stayed upstairs, the voices grew bolder. I told myself it was grief talking, stress talking, a house trying to find a new shape. I told myself too many things. Then came the spreadsheet. Emily printed it and slid it across the table as though it were an invitation. Monthly income, projected expenses, a column in yellow labeled future. Her finger landed on a number circled in ink. The inheritance my grandmother had left me, half already committed to Sophie's college fund, half managed by my mother. Emily smiled in that careful way she used when she wanted something big. What if we bought a house now, she asked, one with a ground floor suite for Harold so Margaret wouldn't have to climb stairs. The deed could go in Margaret's name, only as a formality, she said, because it would help with a tax credit her friend knew about. Chloe could help with the mortgage. We would all contribute. It would be ours, but safe. I felt the shift under my chair. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a blueprint. It wasn't our future. It was a transfer. I told her I would not put my grandmother's money into a house I didn't legally own. I offered to renovate our current place to meet her father's needs, to pay for ramps, rails, even a hospital bed. But I would not sign over control of my life to a plan drawn up in someone else's kitchen. Her smile vanished. Chloe called me rigid from the doorway. Margaret cleared her throat and said families share. Emily stared at the spreadsheet, not at me, and said she couldn't believe I would let technicalities stand in the way of caring for her parents. The room felt smaller, the lights harsher, the cupboards louder each time they closed. From then on, ledger entries turned red more often. Margaret began saving receipts in a glass jar and leaving it next to my keys. Emily started speaking of my account and your account, as if they were guarded borders. She suggested a joint account with a rehearsed calm that made me wonder how many times the three of them had practiced the pitch. I said no, not never, but not now. Not while every request felt like a test I could only fail. Sophie began to notice. Her curious questions faded, replaced by small judgments she barely understood. Why didn't I let Nana have the big bedroom? Why did I work so late if money was still not enough? Why did I never say yes to surprises? I tried. I took her for ice cream, taught her to ride a bike without training wheels, built entire cities out of blocks with her. But at bedtime, she asked Emily to tuck her in, and downstairs the low voices resumed. One night I woke to a light under the kitchen door and found Margaret running numbers with Emily and Chloe. Their heads bent together, three silhouettes against the warm kitchen glow, looked almost tender from the hallway. When Emily saw me, she straightened the papers as if to hide them. Margaret didn't look up. Chloe met my eyes and held them a fraction too long, defiant and bored all at once. We didn't fight that night. We fought the next morning and the one after. The words were ordinary until they weren't. Control, trust, respect. Every time I thought we'd reached the bottom of the argument, another step appeared beneath us. I told her I wanted a marriage between two adults, not a committee. She told me I was closing doors that a good husband would open. A week later, I found a flyer for the house they wanted, tucked into the ledger like a pressed leaf. Someone had written Margaret's name in the space marked owner. The ink had bled slightly through the paper. I stood at the counter for a long time, the kettle hissing, rain drilling softly against the windows. I put the flyer back, closed the ledger, and felt the first clean snap inside myself, a thin seam giving way. It didn't sound like anger. It sounded like something more dangerous. It sounded like the beginning of quiet. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the call came. Patricia had collapsed at her desk. By the time I reached the hospital, they had already rushed her into emergency surgery to remove the clot in her brain. The beeping of the monitors, the sterile white walls, the oxygen mask clouding with each breath, every detail pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. This was the woman who had raised me alone, who had worked 2 jobs so I could go to college. I wasn't going to let her spend her recovery in a cold hospital room. I wanted her home where I could take care of her properly. That night, I told Emily my plan. I would hire a full-time nurse for my mother, someone experienced in stroke rehabilitation. Emily's expression tightened. She didn't say no, not directly. Instead, she said, "If you're paying for a nurse for her, then you can pay for one for Dad, too." She said it as if it were the most natural, reasonable thing in the world. I reminded her that Harold already had daily help from her and Chloe, and that I was covering almost every expense in the house. Hiring a second full-time nurse would drain us quickly. Her arms folded across her chest and her voice cooled. "It's not fair to play favorites." We went in circles for hours, but what unsettled me most wasn't Emily, it was Sophie. She had been sitting at the table coloring, but now she stopped, looking at me with eyes that had already been fed someone else's story. "Why can't you just help Grandpa?" she asked. Her voice carried an edge, the kind that comes from repeating words you've already heard more than once. Emily didn't correct her. Margaret didn't even glance up from her tea. In the days that followed, Sophie's distance grew. She used to run into my arms when I came home from work. Now she stayed in her room, the door half closed, her laughter drifting out only when she was on the phone or with her mother. At dinner, her answers to my questions were clipped, her eyes fixed on her plate. One afternoon, I passed her room and heard her telling a friend, "Dad only cares about his side of the family." The words sliced through me in a way I didn't expect. I told myself it was just a phase, that kids sometimes go through stretches like this. But deep down, I wondered if this was something more deliberate, something planted. And every time I caught Emily and Margaret in hushed conversation, Chloe watching me with that half-smirk she had perfected, my suspicion grew. My place in my own home felt less certain with each passing day. It was like a chair being slowly pushed away from the table. You don't notice at first. You tell yourself it's just the angle, just the light. But then one day you realize you're not sitting at the table anymore. You're standing outside the circle looking in. And the distance you have to cross is far wider than you could have imagined. Harold passed away on a gray morning in early spring. The news came through Chloe's trembling voice over the phone. We all knew his health had been failing, but the finality of it still landed like a stone in my chest. Emily broke down in the living room, her sobs muffled into Sophie's hair. Margaret sat in the armchair, staring out the window as though the world had suddenly gone silent. The responsibility of arranging the funeral fell squarely on me. Emily, Margaret said, was too consumed by grief. Chloe claimed she needed to stay close to her mother. So I took the calls, handled the paperwork, coordinated with the funeral home, and paid every bill. I chose the flowers Harold had once mentioned liking, arranged a slideshow of old photos, even wrote the obituary so it would honor the man he had been before the accident. For days, I worked late into the night, juggling the arrangements alongside my job. On the day of the service, I thought I had done right by him. The chapel was filled, friends, neighbors, old co-workers, faces reflecting respect and quiet sorrow. But that night, Emily's words cut through the quiet like a blade. It wasn't enough. She stood by the bedroom door, arms folded, eyes sharp with accusation. She listed every detail she thought I had overlooked: the food too plain, the music too somber, the flowers not fresh enough. "You could have tried harder," she said, as if I hadn't poured every ounce of myself into making it right. After that night, she stopped sleeping in our bed. At first, she claimed Sophie was shaken and needed her nearby. Weeks passed, months. The arrangement never changed. Our once shared room became hers alone, and the absence beside me was like a constant low hum in the background, too quiet to draw attention to, too loud to ignore. I suggested marriage counseling, desperate to bridge the gap that was widening by the day. Emily agreed, and for a short while the sessions seemed to help. She smiled more, reached for my hand on walks, even sat beside me on the couch again. But it was all surface, a polished act for the therapist's office. At home, she returned to Sophie's room at night, closing the door behind her. I told myself to be patient. That healing took time. I clung to the hope that the woman I had met years ago, the one who once looked at me like I was her whole world, might come back. But deep down, I felt the shift. Our marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a performance, and I was the only one still trying to believe in the act. Losing my mother felt like someone had torn out the last solid pillar holding my life together. Patricia suffered her second stroke in late autumn, and this time there was no miracle surgery, no cautious optimism from the doctors. She was gone within hours, leaving me standing in that cold hospital corridor with the taste of metal in my mouth and an ache I couldn't name. She had been my anchor, my compass, the one person whose faith in me had never wavered. The days after the funeral blurred into each other, legal documents to sign, closing her consultancy firm, boxing up her belongings one room at a time. One rainy afternoon, I was in the kitchen sorting through a stack of envelopes when Sophie's phone buzzed on the counter. She had left it unlocked. The screen lit up with a preview of a message. "Glad the old witch is dead. Now the house is ours. Can't wait for the birthday party." My stomach twisted. My mother reduced to old witch by someone speaking to my daughter. And the house ours? I picked up the phone, my hands cold, and opened the thread. The sender's name meant nothing to me. Scrolling up, I found laughing emojis, inside jokes, and plans that didn't include me at all. Dinners, family outings, and mentions of a man I'd never met. From the way Sophie wrote about him, he was already a fixture in her world. I read until the words blurred, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever this man was, he was close enough to be at my daughter's birthday, close enough for her to write about him like a prize. And my mother's death celebrated as if it had cleared an obstacle instead of breaking our family's spine. When Emily came home, I confronted her, still gripping the phone, my voice shaking with grief and rage. I told her what I'd read, demanded to know who this man was, and why Sophie was speaking about my mother that way. Her reaction was not shock, not denial, it was fury at me. "You went through her phone?" She snapped, her eyes narrowing. "She's a child, Daniel. You violated her privacy." I tried to push past that deflection to make her see the ugliness of the words, the deeper meaning behind them, but she wouldn't even acknowledge the messages. She accused me of mistrusting Sophie, of making a tragedy about myself, of driving a wedge in the family. She snatched the phone from my hand and stormed upstairs, her footsteps echoing like slammed doors. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing against my chest. In the next room, Emily's voice murmured to Sophie, low and steady, like a lullaby. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew, without proof, without the full picture, that I was already on the outside of a story unfolding under my own roof. And whatever that story was, it had started long before I noticed. The message on Sophie's phone never left my mind. It sat there like a stone at the bottom of a river, buried by daily currents but never gone. 3 years passed, and in that time the coldness in my own home shifted from being a shock to being the climate I lived in. Emily changed first. The plain jeans and t-shirts were replaced by tailored dresses, expensive handbags, and heels that clicked across the hardwood like punctuation marks in a language I no longer understood. She began spending more time with friends, disappearing for hours with vague explanations, brunches, shopping trips, charity events I'd never heard of until the day she left for them. Sophie followed her lead. She was a teenager now, her phone always in hand, her eyes rolling at nearly anything I said. If she wasn't out with friends, she was in her room with the door closed, laughter spilling out only when she was talking to someone else. The warmth between us had cooled into a kind of polite distance, and even that felt fragile. Then came the job opportunity I couldn't turn down, a 4-month assignment in another city. The pay increase was significant, the networking invaluable. I convinced myself the distance might even help. Maybe space would give Emily and Sophie a chance to miss me, to remember I was more than a wallet and a list of rules they didn't want to follow. At first, we spoke on the phone most nights, short calls that dwindled to every few days. Emily always sounded bright, almost rehearsed, as if the conversations were part of some performance. Sophie rarely came to the phone at all. When I came home, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Emily's wardrobe had evolved again, sleek evening dresses, jewelry I hadn't bought. She'd quit her part-time job, saying she wanted more time for self-care. She dropped names of new friends, people I'd never met, most from her social circle that seemed to expand while I was away. Sophie was different too, older somehow, more guarded, and far more aligned with her mother in every opinion, every glance they exchanged across the dinner table. They shared a language of looks I wasn't part of. Then I saw the photos. Framed in the living room, they showed Emily and Sophie at a beach, laughing with people I didn't recognize. Another captured them at a restaurant, Emily leaning in towards someone cropped just out of frame. I asked about them. Emily smiled faintly. "Just friends," she said. "Don't overthink it." But I did overthink it. And the more I stared at those smiles, the more I realized they weren't just for the camera. They were for someone else. Someone who'd been there while I was gone. Someone who might have been there all along. It started over breakfast, casual in tone but not in timing. Emily set her coffee down, glanced at me briefly, and said, "Sophie and I are going on a trip with some girlfriends. Just 5 days, nothing big." Her voice was light, but the way she avoided holding my gaze told me this decision had been made long before I was told. She rattled off the details. Beach town a few hours away, staying in a rented villa with friends from her social circle. When I asked who exactly these friends were, she listed names I'd never heard before. My questions didn't change her tone. "You wouldn't know them, Daniel. They're just friends." The morning they left, the house felt unnervingly still. That evening, Emily sent a short text, arrived safely along with a photo of Sophie grinning by the pool. I called, but she replied, "Can't talk now, we're getting ready for dinner." Over the next few days, communication was thin. A couple of photos came through, Emily and Sophie on the beach, sunglasses hiding their eyes, drinks in hand. In the background of one shot, I noticed a group of people lounging on deck chairs. Several of them were men I didn't recognize. Another picture showed Emily at an outdoor cafe leaning toward a man whose face was caught mid-laugh. When I asked about it later, she laughed, a little too quickly. "Just some people we met down here. Relax, it's nothing." The words were airy, but her tone carried the same warning I'd heard before: don't push unless you want to fight. I told myself to let it go. The last few years had taught me that picking every battle only left more wreckage behind. So I folded the unease and tucked it into a quiet corner of my mind, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a harmless vacation. But paranoia has a way of whispering when you least expect it. Driving to work, brushing my teeth, lying awake at night. That cafe scene replayed in my head, the easy curve of her smile, the way she leaned in, the presence of strangers on what was supposed to be a girl's trip. It wasn't proof, not yet. But it was smoke, and if there was smoke somewhere, a fire was already burning. Birthdays had never been a grand affair for me, especially after my mother passed. Still, Emily always managed to mark the day in some small way. A gift, a dinner out, a card signed in Sophie's neat handwriting. It wasn't much, but it was something. A quiet reminder that despite everything, I still mattered to them. This year, the morning began in silence. No happy birthday when I came downstairs. No coffee waiting on the counter. Emily and Sophie were already gone. A note on the fridge read, "Running errands." I told myself it was part of a surprise. By noon, I still hadn't heard from them. My calls went unanswered. My texts stayed on delivered. I sat in my office, staring at my phone, each passing hour chipping away at that fragile hope. At 6 in the evening, the front door finally opened. Emily walked in first, Sophie behind her, both carrying shopping bags. "You've been gone all day," I said, my voice steady. Emily didn't hesitate. "One of my friends was in a car accident. We stayed at the hospital with her." There was no happy birthday, no apology, no acknowledgement of the day at all. Just that flat explanation and the sound of paper bags hitting the counter. Sophie avoided my eyes, slipping upstairs without a word. I tried to picture Emily sitting in a hospital all day, the sterile walls, the smell of antiseptic. But the image didn't match the faint perfume clinging to her, the fresh styling of her hair, or the trace of lipstick still on her lips. That night I sat alone at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. No cake, no candles, no celebration. It was as if my birthday hadn't existed at all. And for the first time, I felt the thought settle cold and heavy in my chest. Maybe, in Emily's world, I didn't exist anymore either. It happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the house felt still, almost heavy. Emily was in the shower. Sophie was in her room. I was in the living room flipping through a pile of unopened mail when Sophie's phone, left on the coffee table, buzzed. The message preview froze me mid-reach. "Tell your mom I love her. Kiss her for me." For a moment, I thought I'd misread it, but when I picked up the phone, the name glared back at me, Ryan Cole. Not a classmate, not a family friend, not anyone I'd ever heard of. I opened the thread. My hands went cold as weeks, months, years of messages unfolded before me. Photos of Emily and Ryan at restaurants, walking along the beach, laughing in selfies. Notes from Sophie telling him when her mother would be free, little winking emojis, even arranging family dinners with him. And the worst part, it wasn't hidden. Sophie knew. She wasn't just aware of the affair, she was helping to protect it. My chest tightened as I scrolled back. 4 years. 4 years of vacations I thought were girls' trips. 4 years of birthdays I missed because they were with him. 4 years of nights Emily claimed she was working late. Even the message that had once gutted me, the one about the old witch being gone, was there in black and white. Ryan's words to my daughter about my mother. When Emily stepped out of the shower, hair damp, wrapped in a towel, I was still sitting on the couch with the phone in my hand. "Who is Ryan Cole?" I asked. Her eyes widened for a split second before narrowing. "Why are you going through Sophie's phone again?" She snapped. I stood, holding the phone out toward her. "Because this man says he loves you, because my daughter knows him better than I do, because the two of you and your entire family have been lying to me for years." Sophie appeared in the doorway, pale, her eyes darting between us. Emily turned to shield her, but I wasn't yelling. My voice was quiet, steady, the kind of calm that comes when anger sinks so deep it no longer boils. "I gave you my trust," I told Emily, "and you built a life with someone else inside my home around my child. You didn't just betray me, you made Sophie part of it." Emily opened her mouth, but no words came. Sophie's lip trembled, but she didn't deny it. And in that moment, the weight of the last 4 years crashed over me. Every unanswered question, every late night, every flicker of doubt, it all had a name now. Ryan Cole. From that moment on, I knew nothing in this house would ever be the same again. That night, the house felt smaller. The walls seemed to press in, as if they too had overheard everything. Emily stood in the living room, her hair still damp from the shower. Sophie hovered behind her like a shadow. Not long after, Chloe and Margaret arrived as though they had been summoned for damage control. I didn't sit. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at each of them in turn and said, "You have 9 days, all of you. Pack your things and be gone by the end of the month." Emily's mouth opened, but I cut her off before a single word could escape. "This is not a negotiation. You've had 4 years to choose where your loyalty lies. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Margaret stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Daniel, let's be reasonable." "No." My tone was flat, unshakable. Reason left this house the day my daughter started helping another man play husband to my wife. The silence that followed was jagged. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't flinch. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the father you wanted," I told her quietly, "but I will give you this one thing: your mother can be with the man you prefer to call Dad." Emily's tears came then, sudden and hot, but they didn't move me. I had cried enough for this marriage. "There's nothing left to discuss," I said. "Tomorrow morning I'm contacting my lawyer. The divorce papers will follow. Until then, the clock is ticking." I turned and walked upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind me. For the first time in years, the bed felt like mine again, not because it brought comfort, but because of the cold, unshakable clarity that I would never share it with her again. 9 days. That was all the mercy I had left to give. The morning after delivering my ultimatum, I called Mark Lawson, an old college friend who had since become one of the sharpest divorce attorneys in the city. There was no small talk. "I'm ending it, Mark. I want it done clean, and I want it done right." Mark's tone was steady, professional. "Then we need evidence, as much as you can get. Affairs are ugly, but winning in court is all about documentation." That's how Ethan Brooks entered the picture, a private investigator with a reputation for precision and discretion. Ethan met me in Mark's office the next afternoon. He listened without interruption as I laid out everything: Ryan's messages, Sophie's involvement, the years of deceit. His only response was a quiet nod before asking for access to anything Emily used regularly: phone records, email accounts, shared calendars, even the Wi-Fi router. The next 2 weeks became a blur of controlled detachment. While I went through the motions of daily life, Ethan was in the background, tracing her steps and combing through her past. What he uncovered was worse than I imagined. There were photographs: Emily and Ryan at restaurants, holding hands in public, kissing in the parking lot of a bar just 3 miles from our home. Screenshots of text messages where she called him my real partner and detailed the nights they'd spent together while I was away for work. The crown jewel was Ryan himself, confronted by Ethan, who approached him under the guise of a mutual acquaintance. Ryan admitted to the affair without hesitation. Whether it was arrogance or stupidity, he even agreed to provide a written statement, complete with dates and places, in exchange for my promise not to send the evidence to his employer or his elderly mother. The audio recording of that conversation was damning. By the time Ethan handed over the final file, the binder was thick: photos, transcripts, financial records showing Emily had used joint funds to cover trips and gifts for Ryan. Mark flipped through the pages slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Daniel," he said, "with this, she's walking into court already beaten." For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief, not joy, but the satisfaction of knowing the truth would finally be undeniable. This was no longer just about ending a marriage. It was about making sure Emily could never rewrite the story to make herself the victim. The day of the hearing dawned cold and sharp, the kind of morning where even the air feels like it's holding its breath. I walked into the courthouse with Mark at my side, Ethan a few steps behind carrying the binder that had become my shield. Across the hall, Emily stood with her attorney, her chin lifted in defiance despite the redness around her eyes. Sophie was there too, close to her mother's side, refusing to look at me. When the judge called us in, the air thickened. Emily's lawyer opened with a sympathetic narrative, painting her as a devoted wife, abandoned emotionally, who had simply sought comfort in friendship. Then it was our turn. Mark's voice was steady, deliberate, surgical. He laid out the facts piece by piece: time-stamped photographs of Emily and Ryan together, transcripts of messages heavy with intimacy, records showing vacations, dinners, and gifts paid for with joint funds. And then came the recording, Ryan's own voice admitting to the affair, confirming its duration, even mocking me for not catching on sooner. Emily's expression shifted with each new piece of evidence, anger giving way to something closer to panic. Her attorney tried to object, but each objection was overruled. The judge leaned forward, scanning the documents, his questions pointed and precise. When Emily took the stand, she claimed the relationship had only started recently, that Sophie's involvement was minimal. Mark countered with messages from years earlier, plans between Emily and Sophie to meet Ryan while I was away for work. The judge read one aloud: "Dad's gone this week, we can go to Ryan's for dinner." The room went still. Emily's shoulders tightened. Sophie stared at the floor. By the time closing arguments came, the outcome was inevitable. The judge ruled swiftly. The house remained in my name. Emily kept only her car and 4 years of limited spousal support. Sophie, now old enough to choose, elected to live with her mother. I didn't contest it. Then I made my own request: formal removal of Sophie from my will. The judge explained I couldn't disown her entirely, but I could ensure she inherited nothing. "Then that's what I'll do," I said, my voice steady. I glanced at Sophie, who finally looked at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. For a moment, I wondered if she understood the cost of her choices. When it was over, I stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. Justice had been served, but justice is a cold comfort when it comes after years of betrayal. The chapter was closing. And Emily would never again be able to pretend she was the wronged party in this story. The divorce was finalized, the ink still fresh on the papers. But closure, that was a lie I wasn't ready to believe. Emily had taken more than half my marriage. She had taken my dignity, my relationship with my daughter, and 4 years of my life. The court had given me the house, but I wanted something that would last longer than bricks and mortar. I wanted the truth about her to follow her everywhere she went. I began with her workplace. I compiled a clean, damning package, photographs, transcripts of messages, Ryan's recorded confession, and bank statements showing how she had used marital funds for trips and gifts. The cover letter was direct, addressed to her supervisor, outlining exactly what one of their employees had done. No embellishment. The facts were ugly enough on their own. Mark warned me to think twice, but I had already thought 100 times. The envelope went out by courier. 2 days later, Emily was let go. The official reason was conduct unbecoming of a company representative. The real reason spread faster than any press release. The gossip burned through the office like wildfire. Next was Ryan's mother. Ethan had found her address, a modest home 2 states away. I knew from Ryan's own words that she despised infidelity. She had raised him alone after being betrayed herself. I sent her a copy of the same package, minus the financial records, along with a short letter. You deserve to know the man your son has chosen to be. 3 weeks later, I learned she had suffered a heart attack after confronting him. She never recovered. A small, cold weight settled in my chest at the news, but it was swallowed by a darker truth. Ryan had walked into my life, destroyed my family, and now he was watching his own unravel. His long-term girlfriend left him within days. His employer quietly terminated his position, citing personal conflicts affecting workplace integrity. Neighbors whispered, friends disappeared. Ryan Cole had become a pariah in the very town where he once strutted with my wife on his arm. As for Emily, the fallout was brutal. The friends from her so-called social circle stopped answering her calls. Margaret and Chloe still stayed close, but even they looked at her differently now, like they could see the cracks in the armor. Sophie clung to her mother, but even she couldn't shield her from the wreckage. I didn't send those packages out of pettiness. I sent them because truth matters, because betrayal doesn't get to hide behind closed doors. And when I finally locked the last file away in my desk, I knew one thing for certain. Emily Harris would never again be able to rewrite the story to make herself the victim. The destruction didn't stop at Emily. Like a slow, rolling wave, it spread outward, touching everyone who had chosen to stand by her side. Chloe was the first to take the hit. She had moved in with a boyfriend shortly after the trial, a man she swore was different from the rest. Within months, the whispers started, neighbors overhearing shouting matches, seeing bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves. He drank heavily, lashed out easily, controlled every aspect of her life. By the time she admitted the truth to anyone, she was already trapped, pregnant with her second child, her first barely able to walk. Margaret, the master strategist who had spent years moving pieces on the board, wasn't untouchable either. One rainy evening, she was struck by a delivery van while crossing a busy intersection. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding. She survived, but the recovery would take the rest of her life. The sharp, commanding voice I had known was replaced by a frail whisper over a hospital bed. Sophie didn't escape the ripple effect. The truth about Emily's affair and the public fallout traveled fast in her high school. Friends she had laughed with for years began to avoid her. Whispered conversations stopped when she walked by. Group chats no longer included her. In photos posted online, she was missing from gatherings she once organized. I heard about it from mutual acquaintances, and though I felt no triumph, I couldn't deny the symmetry. Choices had consequences, hers included. As for me, the decision to leave was both simple and agonizing. The house felt poisoned, every wall echoing with memories of arguments, of whispered betrayals. 8 months after the divorce, I sold it, accepting an offer that gave me more than enough to start over. I chose a city 200 miles away, a place where no one knew the Harris name. My new apartment overlooked a quiet park where the loudest sound was the wind moving through the trees. I joined a gym, took long walks, even signed up for a boxing class. The routine was mine alone, no second guessing, no side glances at a dinner table, no pretending not to hear conversations meant to exclude me. Leaving wasn't just about geography. It was about reclaiming my space, my life. And for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like I was standing in the middle of someone else's storm. Starting over in a new city gave me the quiet I didn't know I'd been craving. Here, I wasn't Daniel Harris, the man whose wife and daughter betrayed him. I was just Daniel. I thought love was something I had buried for good, locked away with the wreckage of my first marriage. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. I met Claire at a community boxing class. She had a quick jab, a sharper wit, and eyes that carried a kind of knowing sadness I recognized instantly. Over coffee after training, she told me her story: an unfaithful husband, a messy divorce, the long climb back to herself. There was no pity between us, only an unspoken understanding. We had both been burned, but neither of us wanted to live in the ashes forever. We started slowly, walks in the park, dinners at small, out-of-the-way places where conversation could stretch without interruption. With Claire, I never had to wonder about hidden meanings or silent judgments. She spoke plainly, laughed easily, and made me feel like I didn't have to compete for her attention. 2 years later, we married in a quiet ceremony, just close friends and a handful of family who had earned their place in our lives. A year after that, our son Noah was born. Holding him for the first time was nothing like the last time I had stood in a hospital room with a newborn. This time, there was no shadow over my shoulder, no knot of doubt in my chest about the woman standing beside me. Noah is 4 now, curious, fearless, with a smile that wipes away every dark memory I've carried. Claire and I have built a home that feels nothing like the one I left behind. Warm, open, grounded in a trust so steady it's almost invisible, like the foundation of a house that's built to last. I won't pretend the past doesn't leave scars. There are still nights when I wake and need a moment to remember where I am, to remind myself that the woman beside me is not Emily. But every morning when I watch Claire scoop Noah into her arms, the fear fades a little more. Against every odd, I've begun to believe again that love, real love, is worth the risk. It started with an email I almost deleted, thinking it was just another piece of spam. The subject line was a single word, Dad. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The message was short, painfully so. Sophie wrote that she knew she had no right to ask for anything, but she needed to tell me she was sorry. Sorry for every word, every lie, every time she had chosen her mother over me. She wanted to meet just once so she could say it to my face. Attached was a scanned receipt for a bank transfer, $20,000 sent to my account. In her note, she wrote, "It's not enough to repay what you spent on me, but it's all I have. I'll work for the rest of my life if I have to. I just want a chance to make it right." I sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open in front of me, rereading those lines as the afternoon light shifted across the floor. Claire found me there, her hands resting lightly on my shoulders. She read the email in silence, then moved to sit across from me. "She's reaching out," Claire said gently. "That means something." "It also means opening a door I closed for a reason," I replied. The idea of seeing Sophie again stirred something deep, part longing, part dread. Memories of her laughter when she was little collided with the image of her in court, standing beside Emily and refusing to meet my eyes. Claire didn't push, but she didn't let it go either. "You don't have to forgive her, but maybe hearing her out will give you peace, and maybe it will give her a chance to grow into someone better than the girl who hurt you." For the next few days, I kept the email flagged, opening it late at night when the house was quiet. $20,000 was a lot for someone her age, especially knowing she had been working part-time after dropping out of college. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the fact that she was willing to part with it as a gesture, clumsy perhaps, but real, of wanting to make amends. I didn't answer her right away. Part of me wanted to ignore it to keep the wound closed. But another part, The one that remembered teaching her to ride a bike and hearing her sing off-key in the school play, wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something left worth salvaging. For days after Sophie's email, I moved through life like I was carrying a weight no one else could see. I poured Noah's cereal in the mornings, answered work emails, sparred at the boxing gym. But my mind kept circling back to that single word in the subject line, Dad. The part of me still bleeding from the past wanted to slam the door shut and never open it again. She had made her choice when she stood beside Emily in court, when she let another man step into the space that was supposed to be mine. I had built a new life, one free of betrayal and half-hearted apologies. Why risk letting any of that poison seep back in? But there was another part of me, quieter, persistent, that whispered about responsibility. Not the legal kind, those ties had been severed. This was something older, deeper. The little girl with scraped knees who used to run to me after school. The teenager who, despite the defiance in her eyes, was still my daughter. That voice reminded me that children don't grow in a vacuum. They are shaped, bent, sometimes twisted by the people who raise them, and Emily had been doing the shaping for years. One night after Noah was asleep, I told Claire my decision. "I'll meet her," I said. "One time, that's all. She needs to hear the truth from me, and I need her to understand there's no going back to what we were." Claire studied my face for a moment before nodding. "Then do it on your terms, not out of guilt, not out of hope, just to close the chapter." That was the plan, no promises, no false expectations. Just a conversation where I could say what needed to be said and walk away knowing I had done my part. Still, as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the thought that closure is a myth. You can put miles between yourself and the past, but some wounds never really heal. They just stop bleeding. And meeting Sophie again would mean reopening one of them, if only for a moment, just to see if there was anything left worth saving. We met at a small cafe halfway between our cities. Sophie was already there when I walked in, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup as if it was the only thing keeping her steady. She looked older than I remembered, lines of worry etched into her forehead and eyes carrying a weight far heavier than her age. For a while, we just sat there in silence. She started to speak, stopped, tried again. Then the words tumbled out, apologies for the things she had said, for the loyalty she had given to Emily without ever questioning the cost, for the years she had let slip away. Her voice cracked and tears welled up, but she didn't look away. I listened, really listened. And when she was done, I told her what I had come to say. "I forgive you," I said quietly and saw the shock in her eyes. "But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. I can't forget what happened, Sophie. I can't erase the choices you made or the pain they caused. I've built a life now, one I need to protect. That means keeping certain doors closed even if it hurts." Her shoulders shook, but she nodded. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. Maybe she understood this was as much as I could give. Before we left, I reached into my coat pocket and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter composed over several late nights. In it, I told her everything I wanted her to remember. That betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those we love most. That trust once broken is harder to rebuild than to guard. And that loyalty is a choice you have to make every day, even when it's not easy. We stood, exchanged a brief hug, hesitant, almost awkward, and then I walked away. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I knew looking back would make it harder to keep walking forward. That night, I sat on the porch of our home, Noah asleep inside, Claire curled up beside me. The air was cool, the sky was clear. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Not the peace of having everything fixed, but the peace of knowing exactly where I stood and who I stood with. The past had already taken enough from me. I wasn't going to let it take my future too, and that's how it ended. The lies exposed, the court battles won, and the betrayal punished. Betrayal from those closest to you cuts the deepest, but it also teaches you the value of boundaries, self-respect, and truth. If you were in his position, would you have forgiven or walked away forever? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how you would handle such a betrayal. This was Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales of love, lies, and revenge.